Greetings, my excellent students. Brian Doak here in the conference room in the College of Christian Studies at George Fox University, coming at you with a lecture video on Darwin, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and other voices from the 19th century, the 1800s. 1800s were an action-packed century. Of course, you had the birth of a lot of democratic government movements in Europe and of course in the United States beginning in 1776, and those are really up and running. And so you have really in major and increasingly sophisticated ways a public sphere in which ideas, reading and writing, science are really beginning to flourish in the 19th century in ways like they never had before, and that just keeps going up and to the right as history progresses. At least it has so far since then. You had great scientific progress, you had the Industrial Revolution, and you have a lot of radical voices which now have more freedom than has ever been had really up to that point in human history to really offer their views and do their writing and teach in university settings and begin to get into the Theodicy game. There's a tractor right outside the window, of course, just to make sure that I'm super distracted while I'm talking. Okay. That noise is a tractor. Okay. So anyway, I want to basically dip into a few of these voices here from the 19th century, and gosh, the tractor's like stalling right outside the window. I'm so mad right now, but I'm not going to start this over. I want to go through a few of these voices. Of course, we're tracking along with Mark Larimore's book, his Reader, The Problem of Evil, an anthology of voices, getting into the problem of evil and theodicy from all the way from way back to Plato and other early voices through almost the contemporary world. Really, the readings go through the late 20th century. I think we've got 5 or 6 thinkers on tap here, so let's just dive into them, kind of hit a few key points and see what we think. First up, Thomas Robert Malthus, an essay on the principle of population. A British guy, lived from 1766 to 1834, so really doing a lot of his writing at the beginning of the 19th century. He had a rather fascinating perspective on theodicy and on suffering. He was a scientist, really, I guess, a geographer and an economist, Larimore says in his introduction, who basically had a really fascinating idea. He was worried about overpopulation, which is in some ways a different worry from what a lot of people are facing in the United States, at least around the time of the recording of this video. The fear is maybe underpopulation, that maybe millennials aren't having enough babies, not getting married, not buying houses and doing the kind of stuff to kind of keep things going. In his time, and certainly in other places in the world today, the fear is overpopulation. And Malthus has a solution to overpopulation and all of the evils that not having enough resources cause. The solution? Control yourself sexually. Okay, that's what he has to say. Control yourself sexually. Do not produce kids that you can't afford, that you can't pay for. And basically, we'll be okay. Strict chastity. I'm reading here from the beginning of the essay. One of the principal reasons which have prevented an assent to the doctrine of the constant tendency of population to increase beyond the means of subsistence is a great unwillingness to believe that the deity would by the law of nature bring beings into existence, which by the laws of nature could not be supported in that existence. That is a strange kind of theodicy problem. Why would it be the case that biologically we can do something that would harm us? Why would certain people be able to even procreate when it would harm them to do so? I think, for example, of my sister-in-law. I remember being confronted with this theodicy problem years ago, and my sister-in-law, Anna, this wonderful woman, when she first became pregnant, I remember hearing that she had to have a cesarean, a C-section, because her body was just like too small to like have a child in the normal way. No big deal. People have C-sections all the time. It's just like part of modern medicine. Part of modern medicine, like as of the last couple of decades, right? But I remember feeling so stunned thinking, oh my gosh, like my sister-in-law would have died in a prior era that didn't have the kind of technology that could get a baby out in a really safe way. So why is it that a body would be able to get pregnant but then die during that pregnancy or that delivery? That makes no sense. Like, you just, like, what? So he's worried about this. He's saying, like, how, you look at God and, like, how could God have created a world like this? He says, well, look, yeah, there are those general laws of nature, but there are other laws too, like moral restraint, okay? So don't worry about don't worry about attacking the goodness of the deity. It's not about that. It's about you, O person, and about your problems with your own virtue, controlling your sexuality. He says, every act, this is on page 238 of the Reader, every act which was prompted by the desire of immediate gratification, but which threatened an ultimate overbalance of pain, would be considered as a breach of duty, and consequently no man whose earnings were only sufficient to maintain 2 children would put himself in a situation in which he might have to maintain 4 or 5, however he might be prompted to it by the passion of love. So it's pretty simple. It's a fascinating sort of concept. It might be offensive to think of it that way, or I don't know how it strikes you. But he says, in conclusion, at least to this part of the reading, page 240, there are perhaps few actions that tend so directly to diminish the general happiness as to marry without the means of supporting children. In some ways, this reminds me of Rousseau in his letter to Voltaire in the aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake, where Voltaire had said, look, don't blame God for earthquakes, blame people for building buildings that are too high in the path of earthquakes, okay? So it's a kind of radical personal responsibility type of message. So we got that going for us. How about Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American philosopher, author, also living in the 1800s, almost lived throughout the entire century, 1803 to 1882. Emerson really is kind of like a throwback to the Stoics. So do the Stoics go away? No. And we don't want to give the kind of mistaken impression, as in this march we're doing through the history of theodicy by using Larimore's Reader, that somehow there are theodicy ideas that are popular in a certain era, but then they go away, and then they're replaced by a new idea, and then those go away, and then they're replaced by a new idea. No, the old ideas are all still around. And so this kind of Stoic line of theodicy remains really popular and remains one key approach to theodicy that can be tweaked and picked up in various ways. And if you read this selection from Emerson's essay, The Tragic, you'll see that he really gets into some Stoic type stuff. For example, let's just read the first sentence. He has seen but half the universe who has never been shown the house of pain. Okay? So unless you've been living in the house of pain, you've been living in half the universe. You got to experience the full universe, people. Okay? There are tragic elements in life, and those tragic elements have meaning, and that, in fact, we need to engage with it in order to become full adults. He also gets into some of this stuff, which maybe reminds us of Augustine and some Stoic ideas about evil not really being a thing, or really evil is all about how we perceive what's happening, not about what's actually happening. So page 259 at the top of the page, Emerson says, frankly then, it is necessary to show that all sorrow dwells in a low region. It is superficial, for the most part fantastic, or in the appearance and not in things. If a man says, lo, I suffer, it is apparent that he suffers not, for grief is dumb. It is so distributed as not to destroy. That which would rend you falls on tougher textures. Okay. How should you behave in the face of suffering? A man should not commit his tranquility to things, but should keep as much as possible the reins in his own hands, rarely giving way to extreme emotions of joy or grief. So Emerson says, just kind of keep it on the level. When things are going well, don't get too excited. When things are going badly, don't cry your eyes out. Just try to keep everything very calm, very medium, and know that in fact, mostly when we worry about evil and all these problems, it's mostly fantastical. It's just kind of out there. It's not really real. Okay, so you get kind of a mashup here of some ideas like Augustine, the idea that evil isn't really a thing. It's and then also some Stoic ideas like we don't need to really, we don't need to cry, we don't need to worry. God's not in charge, as Seneca had said. God's not in charge of our luggage. We kind of move through this life, and we got to kind of be tested and see how it goes. So Emerson's a nice throwback to some of those ideas, which you'll see again. He has a point too, and I'm reading on page 260 here, which I think is very true, and it's worth thinking about. I mean, first of all, so to back it up, the Stoic ideal could be really obnoxious, could be morally offensive. Why? Well, watch a child die of cancer. Watch someone be murdered in the prime of their life. To say that evil isn't real or people don't really suffer? Really? No, they do really suffer. So you have to ask yourself, can you really get on board? This Stoic thing might sound good at first, but like, can you really get on board with it? Can you really eat that cake? The idea that really there is no evil. Yeah, you suffer, but it's just like a passing thing. Maybe if one lives in a position of extreme privilege and really hasn't faced suffering, you could say that a little more easily. Still, though, he has a paragraph here on page 260 that I want to read that I think is true in a way and is worth thinking about. He says on page 260, time, the consoler, time, the rich carrier of all change, dries the freshest tears by obtruding new figures, new costumes, new roads on our eye, new voices on our ear. As the west wind lifts up again the heads of the wheat which were bent down and lodged in the storm, and combs out the matted and disheveled grass as it lay in night locks on the ground, so we let in time as a drying wind into the seed field of thoughts which are dark and wet and low bent. Time restores them temper and elasticity. How fast we forget the blow that threatened to cripple us. Nature will not sit still. The faculties will do somewhat. New hopes spring, new affections twine, and the broken is whole again. And the next paragraph says, our human being is wonderfully plastic. It's a good point. I mean, maybe you can think of a time in your life, for example, when you were really sick. Can you think of a time like that? I know the thing that comes into my mind was when I was in my PhD program, there was a 48-hour period where I have never been that sick. I just have never puked like that in my life before or since. I pray I never do again. I just never felt that horrible. It's like I probably just had like a really bad stomach virus or food poisoning or something like that, but I could barely move. It's like the kind of thing like you're laying on the bathroom floor. And in that moment when I was experiencing that, I'm lucky actually that that's the sickest I've ever been, that it wasn't something worse, but that's what comes to my mind when I think of like the sickest I've ever been. And, when I was laying there on the bathroom floor, I mean, it's like you kind of think thoughts like, I'm going to die, There's nothing that quite centers experience. I think, this is just me, I'm sorry, this is a little gross, but I'm going to go there. There's nothing that really centers thought and experience like throwing up. Vomiting just like puts you in this moment, right? Where it's like, you can think about nothing else. And for me, whenever I'm throwing up, the only thought in my mind is like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. Like that's and it focuses you, right? Like vomiting, throwing up focuses you like almost nothing else. And you're just stuck there in this moment of just pure, just utter suffering and focus on that. I imagine for women who have had children, like probably childbirth is like some nuclear extreme version of something like that, where it's just like the pain is so intense that just the focus on the pain and on what's happening is so striking. But I think to myself, I think back on that time of sickness and I'm, talking about puking and it's like, I'm kind of laughing about it, like where is that pain now? I thought it was going to end my life in the moment, but, once you feel better, it's like, oh yeah, it's okay, And I think Emerson's putting his finger on something here, like, yeah, suffering's kind of like that. Not all suffering is like that, and of course some suffering just leads to death, which doesn't allow any reprieve or any kind of break at all. So I don't know. You have to think about that, but think about it. The opposite is true though too with suffering, isn't it? That it's also the case that when you do something that's really wonderful and you have this beautiful experience, when you're suffering, it's not easy to just like take that good experience and just import it into your life. You can remember stuff, but sometimes memories of good times don't just erase the bad thing you're going through. You can kind of go to a happy place in your mind, but does that really work? All in all, I guess the point is it's hard to drag either suffering or happiness from one period of your life into another and really make it happen if you've kind of gone past it. So he's making that point saying, look, we recover. People are good at recovering. So I don't know. The next reading, if you turn the page in the reader, if you have it on you, for example, like I do, is from Arthur Schopenhauer's famous book, The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer was a philosopher and was a big influence on one of the most famous figures in all philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. You've probably heard of Nietzsche, but maybe not Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a famous pessimist. I'll just highlight one idea from Schopenhauer's, the selection that Larimore has here, which is really fascinating, and I hope you'll have a chance to read it. I mean, he just says a bunch of like very pessimistic things. He just says like, look, you look out at the world and the world is horrible. Non-existence would be preferable to existence. The world is something which at bottom ought not to be. The world is the battleground of tormented and agonized beings who continue to exist only by devouring each other. Okay. So some cheery notes on theodicy for your day. In fact, Schopenhauer takes it so far, and here's my point of emphasis on page 264 in the reading from his book, The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer says, oh, you've heard of Leibniz, right? This idea of the best of all possible worlds. The idea that if God chose our world, it must be the best. God could have chosen anything. God is good, therefore, he chose this world, therefore, our world must be the best world possible, right? Remember that? Schopenhauer says, no, actually, it's probably true that we're living in the worst of all possible worlds, okay? So this is a new idea, the worst of all possible worlds. Page 264 in the middle. But against this palpably sophistical proofs, of Leibniz, that's like a philosophical slam. Sophistry is like philosophical argument that doesn't make sense, is irrational. He's saying basically, against Leibniz, who doesn't know what he's talking about, his idea that this is the best of all possible worlds, we may even oppose seriously and honestly the proof that this is the worst of all possible worlds. He says, now the world is arranged as it had to be if it were to be capable of continuing with great difficulty to exist. If the world were only a little worse, it would no longer be capable of continuing to exist. Consequently, since a worse world could not continue to exist, it is absolutely impossible. And so this world itself is the worst of all possible worlds. Are we living in the best of all possible worlds or the worst of all possible worlds? With regards to suffering and just the way things are. Are we living in the only possible world? But back to Leibniz's ideas, according to Leibniz, we can't be living in the only possible world, right? Because Leibniz said that if God is good and God is omnipotent, God has any number of, like an infinity of options in God's own mind that could be chosen. So, are we living in the best possible world, the worst possible world, the only world that can possibly exist, the only world that does exist? Should we go back to ideas from like Rousseau or Conway or even Leibniz, who suggested that maybe there are other globes out there, other alien universes, and that there are in fact other kinds of ways that we could be? Are we living in a multiverse, an idea made popular by the Christopher Nolan film Interstellar, where there are like infinite versions of ourselves? I think the multiverse idea, at least one popular version of it, is this idea that anything that can exist does exist. So like somewhere there's another universe, another world in which exactly me, I'm living, but I have I don't have glasses. I can see perfectly. I don't have the astigmatism that I have. But everything else is the same. And then there's a world in which I've lost an arm, but I'm married to a different woman, or just like no matter what kind of wild, weird thing you can imagine, anything that can exist does exist. The idea being, if the universe is infinite and if things just kind of clash off of each other, given enough time, namely infinity, and an infinity of things will happen, so that anything that is possible to happen will happen. How many worlds are there? Is this the best world or the worst world? Okay, so that's the kind of crazy thing you can get into when you start thinking about the best possible world or the worst possible world, as Schopenhauer has it, okay. There's a very short selection in Laramore's Reader from Charles Darwin, a letter that Darwin had written. Thinking about evolution in terms of theodicy is super fascinating. Of course, you can think of evolution in atheistic terms as just a totally naturalistic explanation without God for how organisms come to be. Of course, Christians who accept evolution as a scientific theory that's been floated and it has been basically proven until we find something better, can still see the problems there, but also see a God who's somehow behind it. Although maybe, it gets more difficult, for Christians who follow evolutionary theory to really see a God behind it all. Why would a God oversee a natural system which has so much nature suffering? I mean, think about the amount of animals think about the brutality of the animal world, You can watch a nature video and see cheetahs ripping apart a wildebeest and think like, wow, is this really what nature is? Nature's brutal, Forest fires, the regeneration of things. Yes, there's beauty there, but also an immense amount of destruction. A lot of baby birds that are born die. How does that work? So in this letter, Darwin says, look, I'm not trying to be an atheist. My understanding is that Darwin, in the beginning of his career, tried to say that he didn't think there was any conflict with evolutionary theory and faith. in God. But later in his career, he did think there was a problem. But I'm not a scientist or an expert on any of this. But he ends the letter essentially saying look, our universe is wonderful. You can see that it's beautiful, and yet, to conclude that everything is the result of brute force, I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from designed laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. So maybe something trending toward something like a deist conception, where there's a creator out there and God sets it into motion, but then the way it works out is kind of like just left up to the brutality of whatever nature is like. And you'd have to ask about the character and the goodness of a God who in fact does that. He ends the letter by saying, he says, I see no reason why a man or other animal may not have been aboriginally produced by other laws, and that all these laws may have been expressly designed by an omniscient creator who foresaw every future event and consequence. But the more I think, the more bewildered I become. So he kind of ends on a note of bewilderment. How do you make sense of it all? Of a brutal nature and of evolutionary theory, and yet of a God who could set that into motion and leave us with the world that we've been left with. Last but not least, we have a couple of authors. I'll just cover them very briefly here. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. These are two fascinating figures from the 19th century. Dostoevsky, a Russian novelist and philosopher, and Nietzsche, a German scholar and philosopher. Dostoevsky's, the reading in the reader from Dostoevsky is from his book, The Brothers Karamazov, and a famous section that talks about the suffering of children. Look, if you've been going throughout this whole course and you're like, yeah, none of this really moves me that much. I don't know if evil is really a problem. People just get what they pay for. I don't know. Wait till you read the section in the reader, if you can get to it, from Dostoevsky about the suffering of children. He just puts out a couple of heart-rending scenes. And this is really, it's set as a conversation between Ivan, or Ivan, however it's pronounced, and Alyosha. Okay. Alyosha is a Christian, but Ivan is an atheist. And Ivan is just putting it out there why he thinks that he just will not believe in God. He talks about the suffering of children in heart-rending terms, children being ripped apart by dogs, children being tortured, and says, look, in a world where that happens, I will not consent. I do not consent to live in that world. I won't live in it. I don't care. I will have justice. I don't care about God, he says. You can have a God, whatever. I'm not worshiping that God. The God that allows children to die in the way that children die in our world, I will not worship him, Ivan says. He says, I must have justice or I will destroy myself. I want to be there when everyone suddenly understands what it has all been for. All the religions of the world are built on this longing, and I am a believer. But then there are the children, and what am I to do about them? I've only taken the children because in their case, what I mean is so unanswerably clear. Listen, if all must suffer to pay for the eternal harmony, what have children to do with it? Tell me, please. And I think children are the best case for really getting into the ugly mud, the muck and the dirt of the theodicy problem. You got to think about children. You've got to think about just the suffering, the disability, the pain. Children that are born in the womb. Children that are just born to die, essentially, before having any kind of meaningful life whatsoever. That's the depth to which you must go in thinking about theodicy. And Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov takes us to that depth in this speech, right? And so, so it's a very powerful kind of passage there. What is Dostoevsky's overall view of suffering? Does he himself have a philosophy? Scholars have written about Dostoevsky and tried to, wonder what it would be. There's an interesting passage in another book, which is, something I just happened to be reading on my own, also by Dostoevsky recently, called Notes from the Underground, in which the character there puts forth a theory. Maybe it was Dostoevsky's own idea, I don't know. But certainly the characters in the book, which says, look, people like suffering. We love it. Suffering kind of makes us whole. It kind of gives us something to fight against. It gives us a sort of striving. And we sort of make, we're basically, without suffering, we'd be bored. Okay. Maybe has some ties to a Stoic type view in that suffering is necessary for a kind of full appreciation of life and health and good things too. And finally, Nietzsche. What of Nietzsche? Nietzsche, in his book on the genealogy of morality, has a fascinating take on suffering and of how we conceive of the origins of good and evil. What is good and evil? Where do we even get these words from? And Nietzsche does a kind of a word genealogy on this word good. And he says, you know where we get the word good from? Good is just like what rich people say it is, basically. The word good means people with a lot of money and a lot of stuff, you know. They control everyone, and they have decided what's good and what's bad. And what you get, and I'm grossly simplifying Nietzsche here, but he says basically, you know, what Christianity has done is looked out at the world. Christians are weaklings. Christians are weak. You know, I mean, just think about the Savior. He dies on a cross. He's not a super strong figure. And we've looked at other people who get what we want in the world, who have power and who have all, you know, they're running the show. And we've basically gotten resentful. He calls this ressentiment in French, but it's really just the word resentment. We look at them and what we tried to do is say, well, it's not really that there's good and evil in the universe, but rather I want what you have. Let's say you have something that I want. Let's say you live next door to me and you have a beautiful house, and you have, let's say you have all kinds of beautiful, well-dressed people coming to your house, just bringing platters of food and bottles of wine in every day, and I see that next door and I'm like, I want that. I wish that was my life. I'm so jealous of you and what you have, and I can't get it. So what do I do? In order to get some power over you, what I do is I start to develop like kind of a morality, and I say, the rich, you know, the cars that you have, you shouldn't have those cars. No one should own more than one car, but you have three, so you're a bad person. And all those people coming in there, those men and those women, all your wanton parties and sexual activity. In reality, maybe I want it, but really now I start to stigmatize it, and I say, oh, you know, you're bad. You're a bad person, actually. Yes, that's what you are. You're bad. I may not have those things, but at least I'm a good person, right? It's resentment. This is what Nietzsche says, all morality is built on something kind of like this. We would want those platters of food and wine and women and men and cars and all that stuff if we could get it, but you're just too big of a wimp to get it, and so you have to basically stigmatize other people and moralize it. And you know, what we call good and evil is just kind of like this game where essentially it's all about who has the most power. So goodness and evil, it's just a function of power. You can't really call anything good in and of itself. There's just power in the world. So that's a very challenging take on thinking about theodicy as well. So hopefully you can see just from these little snippets of these 19th century thinkers that the theodicy problem is getting really serious in the 1800s for a lot of thinkers, and we're going in a lot of different directions now for thinking about how this problem of suffering and evil could be dealt with. Not all of them in light of traditional theological ideas either, of the idea of there being a good God and so on, which Nietzsche clearly didn't hold to, and maybe Darwin did at one point in his life, but not later. Schopenhauer probably not, and so on. All right, that's it for the 19th century for now. See ya.